Right, it's my pleasure to introduce Nick, G4FAL. I think he's a man who doesn't actually need much of an introduction because obviously, looking around the room, we all know him as the head of the RSGB Contest Committee.
HF.
Sorry, HF, not R. Yes, HF Contest Committee. And obviously a contester and a DXer, as we all know. But particularly this afternoon, his interest is in the sort of marathon type things, and you did the FIFA World Cup one, and of course the Cricket World Cup, which of course we won, and what was it, 440,000 QSOs, which is the biggest of that event. But anyway, now we're going to talk about transatlantic tests and the first across. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Okay, so while I'm doing this talk, the other Chris here is going to be carrying around a sign-up list, and what we'd like you to do is indicate if you want to just show an interest in the event. You're not committing to anything, but it does mean we can contact you later. If you're listening online or watching online, you'll be able to find on the RSGB website how you can sign up for the event. So what I'm going to do, I'll just explain what the presentation is. I'm going to go through the history of the transatlantic tests from the 1920s and explain why we're going to be celebrating in December this year in particular, and then a few details about the actual celebrations this year. Okay, a word of warning, there are lots of words in this presentation. It's death by PowerPoint, but you don't have to read them all. All you have to do is get the gist of the talk, and there are lots of direct quotes scanned from magazines from the 1920s, and as I say, if you just scan them, you'll get the idea of what's going on. So the transatlantic tests. There were 4 tests held in the early 1920s, and a simple summary. The first, well, they weren't called the first tests, but those tests that were first were a complete failure. In February 21, December 21, there were tests that were an ARRL success, which we heard a lot about last year, and I'll mention again. December 22 was when the RSGB had, well, we had our success, and then in 2023, there was the 4th set of tests that were rather eclipsed by what a particular French gentleman had been getting up to, which we'll explore in more detail. But if we start by thinking about what our expectations of HF amateur radio are now, I've got a couple of suggestions here. One is that we can achieve two-way communication worldwide on the shortwave bands, and we can transmit and receive from our homes with low power, simple aerials, and do very well. Well, things were very different in the early 1920s. And if we start in the USA, after the First World War, the Yanks started in 1919, and they were able to use powers of up to 1 kilowatt. And very quickly they established a network throughout the States where they could send messages on behalf of third parties. And I've always thought it was a bit curious, this, because it's never really been a thing that has been done a huge amount in the UK or even in Europe, I don't think. But of course the Americans had this phone patch thing that went on for years and years, where messages could be sent for third parties by amateur radio. But also thermionic valves were becoming available. There was a change in technology. Things were moving pretty fast, and that really had an effect on receiver sensitivity and the demise of the spark transmitter. But things in Britain were a little bit slower. The licenses were restarted slightly later than in the US, and they were much more restricted. So this is a very early list of call signs from October 1920. And you can just about make out there that these people were licensed to use 10 watts and only to operate for certain hours of the day. And sometimes the licenses actually restricted who it was you could talk to. So we were on 10 watts and the Americans were on 1 kilowatt. And so things were a little different. A quick comparison then. In the USA, there were already thousands of amateurs in the early 20s. Here, hundreds. The Americans were using high power and unrestricted times of operating, and here we were restricted. They seem to be pretty unrestricted for aerials, where we had aerials that were restricted for dimensions. They had this network. We were restricted to certain partners. They really began to have an opportunity to pursue DX, which we didn't have. And of course, the commercial stations were already communicating across the Atlantic using pretty long wavelengths, but massive aerials and massive power. And the radio amateurs, we were actually operating around 200 meters. So somewhere sort of at the medium wave, the end of medium wave that approaches short wave, we would say nowadays. But there hadn't really been any operating anywhere at wavelengths shorter than 200 meters. Well, you might say, well, no wonder we couldn't get across the Atlantic. And that's pretty much what the truth is. Okay, so the first series of tests. This chap, Milton Sleeper, who worked for Everyday Engineering, proposed in 1920 that a series of tests should be carried out. This would be with the Americans transmitting and with Europeans listening to see if anyone could get a signal across the Atlantic. And what was interesting was that he had this prophecy. He said, the first person who is able to transmit across the Atlantic, his name will never be forgotten. A bit misogynistic, but it was the transmitter who he was proposing would be the person who would be remembered. And now we introduce two key characters to the story. Philip Corsi was I think he was the editor of Wireless World. He was a member of the Wireless Society of London, and he had already been asked to get involved in these transatlantic tests to coordinate them from the European side of the pond. And then a chap called Leon Deloy replied to the article that was put in the Everyday Engineering and said he'd love to get involved. Well, Leon Deloy rather became the RSGB's nemesis over the years that were ahead of this. And we'll hear more about him as we go through the story. So, in the build-up to the tests, when Everyday Engineering just happened to go down the tubes at the very beginning, the ARRL took over the tests, promising to see them through to the end. And the rules were very simple. The tests would be from west to east for 3 nights in February, and the US participants would include a unique code with their call sign, and Philip Corsi had a brown envelope with the codes in. So if anyone reported having heard one of these Americans, and if they had the right code and it matched up, that would verify that the transmission had got across. And Fred Snell became the coordinator for the ARRL. He was called the traffic manager. Okay, well, things didn't go particularly well. The tests only ran for the 3 nights, and despite 250 UK stations registering to take part, only 30 submitted a log, and there were none of them where this code could be verified against a call sign. And the Americans cited various reasons for this. They said that the tests were too short, the British lacked experience, and the British were using equipment that was inferior to theirs. And they were pretty disappointed. And this is from QST. And then this fella, Warner, he placed a bit of a bet with the British, saying that if an American amateur were to be sent over, he'd have no trouble hearing the US signals. So this, of course, got the British blood boiling a little bit. And you might have heard of Kenneth Warner's bet, but we'll come on to that in a minute. Okay, so a second set of tests were proposed, and this was beginning to be publicised on both sides of the Atlantic. And the second tests were in December. This was the December after the February of the first tests. And of course, they were now called the second tests. So Fred Snell proposed to the ARRL that they should send a qualified American amateur with American apparatus, and this chap, Paul Godley, who was a 32-year-old expert amateur, was decided that he would be sponsored to come over to England, it was described as. Now, I rather love these cartoons from the 1920s. And there's also a bit of engineering there. You can see that rotary converter at the bottom. And these tended to be used to get a very high voltages for the HT supplies. A little bit later, you'll see one of the circuits of a very early transmitter. It's a little bit horrendous, but quite exciting. And like the chap here saying he's going to get out before the whole place blows up. I didn't really see any cartoons in the British publications. I think we're all a bit too serious about these things. Okay. Now, the tests were a big deal in amateur radio circles, and they featured in all the journals on both sides of the Atlantic. And Philip Corsi encouraged the British participation. And there was some disquiet expressed at the thought of an American coming to show us how to do it, as you can probably imagine. I rather love this QST cover, which shows these, you see the little figures tied up at on a spike at the North Pole, the QRM babies. And then the British, or the English would have been described, amateur there with a pair of headphones clamped on with a G-cramp onto his head to listen to the Americans. So as with the first test, this again was going to be just from west to east. So no opportunity for us to transmit back. But then we were only licensed to use 10 watts anyway. And again, there was this unique code, and Philip would have this brown envelope with all the unique codes in it. And here is Paul Godley, with his Paragon receiver. He was known as Paragon Paul. You can see him there with his bit of kit. And he got aboard the Aquitania and headed for Southampton. And in the photo there, Kenneth Warner, the chap who made the bet about the hat, I think he was the ARRL secretary, and Fred Snell, the traffic manager, on the right, all looking rather smart on the deck as they saw him off. And it just so happened, what a coincidence, that the chap called Harold Beveridge just happened to be on the ship. And he spent most of the journey explaining to Godley that he needed to try one of his long wire receive aerials, which he indeed did. But I quite like the description of Beveridge as a hard-boiled ham. It's not really a description I've heard very much since. Okay, so we know Beveridge. We know that Godley came to England, but he didn't stay in England. He ended up in Scotland. And this little cutting explains the reason. He was wined and dined in London, but he headed to Scotland to escape the atmosphere and the radio conditions down south. And he had some promised help from Marconi with setting up his receiving station in Ardrossan on the coast. And here's a picture of Godley. It's not Godley there, but this is his tent, and that's one of Marconi's fellows who was helping Godley. And I think you can just about make out some poles for his Beveridge aerial just to the side of the tent there. Well, that building is still standing, and that's now an old people's home. I'll mention that in a little while. Okay, so the test started, and on the first day, Godley didn't actually hear anything. But then the next night, he managed to hear the RCA, the Radio Club of America station, 1BCG, that had been specially set up in Connecticut. And I really like this little phrase he used, the sweetest song I have ever heard. And I think we all remember times when we've heard some radio signal coming out of the ether and thought, that's fantastic. Might be some VK in the Commonwealth contest or something that we're looking for on 80 meters or whatever. So we can sort of empathize with Godley at that point. Well, there was a bit of a period of confusion followed. I won't explain in detail, but 2 nights went past. But on the fourth night, Godley actually received a personal message sent from the 1BCG station. This is it. This is his handwritten note of the message and a sort of translation of it. Hearty congratulations from Burghard, Inman, Grinnan, Armstrong, Amy and Cronkite. It was like the first half QSO across the Atlantic. Well, the Americans were euphoric, and the news even made it into the New York Times. And the QST cover in January showed the list of all the Spark stations and the CW stations that Godley had verified. CW referring to the stations with the thermionic valves as opposed to the Spark. It doesn't just mean Morse. Also like this, oh Mr. Printer, how many exclamation points have you got? Trot them all out, we're going to need them badly because we got across. So very triumphalistic. And what's more, our friend Kenneth Warner ended up with his hat that was provided by Burnham for the Wireless Society of London. We're not sure that Burnham actually knew what a spring hat was, but he provided an appropriate hat anyway, and it's still in the ARRL offices now. But I remember the prophecy of Milton Sleeper. Well, it's interesting that we don't remember the names of the people who transmitted. What we remember, ironically, is the name of the person who received the message, Godley. And it's his name that will never be forgotten. And this plaque here is on the wall at the front of that old folks' home that I showed you in the earlier picture. It's very difficult to read it. I've been and looked at it, but it's one that RSGB put there. When the dust settled, it was actually shown that Godley wasn't the first person to positively verify the US stations. He did get the first sort of half QSO personal message, but this chap W. Byrne of Sale, Cheshire, was found to have verified. He got the code in the brown envelope for the American stations on the night when Godley heard nothing. So that brings us to the end of the second tests, and all the excitement meant that another set of tests were planned for the following December, which of course was the December 22, which is the one that we're heading towards the centenary of. And these tests were announced by Fred Snell in QST and by Philip Coursey in Wireless World. So what was the context? In November, the Wireless Society of London became the RSGB. So that's actually next month, 100 years since the RSGB had its name. Although we have celebrated 100 years since the Wireless Society of London was formed. Amateurs still using 200 meters. UK licensees still only using 10 watts. But some special permits were applied for so that the people on this side of the Atlantic could have a go at transmitting back the other way. And this was going to be the RSGB, the newly formed or the newly named RSGB's opportunity to transmit from east to west. But our nemesis Leon Deloy was also lurking here, and he had a pretty powerful station set up on 200 meters as well. So there was a bit of a threat to the RSGB potentially achieving the first east to west. So we were going to have this time 10 nights for each side, exactly either side of the winter solstice. So the Americans would have 10 nights to transmit to us, and then after the winter solstice we'd have 10 nights to transmit back the other way. Another lovely cover with this time the QRM babies. It says they're sort of escaping from their ropes. It's interesting that QRM and QRN are not new things for us. They were very common. But Snell was very excited about the prospect of hearing European signals eventually leading to two-way communication. Okay, the first 10 days went by, and at the halfway stage, lots of American stations on 200 meters had been heard on this side of the Atlantic. Then we come on to the story which we're really interested in and which we're celebrating this year, which was the story of 5WS. Well, we say G5WS now, but of course they didn't have the G in 1922. And this story is covered in great detail in Wireless World in January 1923, and there's a little bits from it. So Philip Coursey got a team of people together. He got a license for a kilowatt and for a large aerial, and his team approached the generating station at Richmond for a location to operate, and the Richmond engineers weren't able to help, but they then referred the gang to the County of London Electricity Supply Company. And a fellow called Mr. Bacon, the chief engineer, was approached, and he was very sympathetic. The matter was put before the directors of the company, and consent was obtained to use this massive chimney stack to support an area. And this chimney is actually nearly 200 feet tall, 60 metres tall. And the RSGB employed a team of steeplejacks. I dread to think how they actually got to the top of the chimney, but they got up there with ladders and ropes and whatever, sky hooks, and fitted a pulley at the top and a lanyard to haul up the aerial. Now, this is actually a pretty damn impressive aerial from a 200-foot chimney, as you can probably imagine. So here's the circuit of the transmitter. Again, rotary converter. Now, they did have a rotary converter, but they couldn't get it to work with the motor. So they used a separate motor and a pulley to drive the converter to provide 6,000 volts through a step-up transformer. And then they keyed the primary circuit, the 100-volt circuit, to drive the step-up transformer. And you can note the directly heated cathodes on the two. This has only got four active components here, two rectifiers and two triodes. I mean, it's a beast of a thing. This is basically a 1 kilowatt oscillator. But we dread to think what it might sound like nowadays, but it did transmit. And they calculated that 5WS was actually putting out more RF than the 1BCG station had the previous year. This is the only photograph we've got of the 5WS station. You can see the sort of rotary generator part of the rotary converter on the right there on the floor, but I don't know what the other things are. Apparently, some nights the door was locked and people had to climb through the window to get into the station. Okay, and this was the great success for the RSGB. And here we have the report that came back from the ARRL. 5 watch sail. The old phonetics were used to say that the first station to be heard and verified was the RSGB station, and it's quite nice, that last little phrase, no French signals recorded. So this time we had actually beaten the French. When things were pulled together after the event, it was found that 315 different North American stations had been heard in the first 10 days, but only 20 amateurs in America actually heard the European signals, and they heard they heard 5WS verifiably first, and then of course Leon did get in there and get his signal across as well. But it was our station that was undeniably the first European amateur station to be heard on the west side of the Atlantic. We were the first to get across, and that's why we're celebrating later this year. Okay, we're just going to quickly go through what happened in the 4th series of tests. These were a little more disappointing. Still, there had not been any two-way communications by this time. But this is the following December, December 23, the plans were made to have another set of tests with the aim to eventually reach a point where two-way communication could be achieved. But meanwhile, the Americans had been engaged in some trials beginning to look at using shorter wavelengths. And this chap, Boyd Phelps, was the first to publish anything in QST. He's basically saying, hang on a minute, there's loads of wavelengths other than 200 meters. We've got a vast, I mean, if you imagine amateurs were licensed to use the entire spectrum of wavelengths shorter than 200 meters. That's virtually all the spectrum we use now. It was a crazy situation, and weren't using it. And Leon Deloy, not being a fool and being wealthy, traveled to the States to do 3 things. This was all not long before the 4th set of tests. He visited some US amateurs at their stations and made plans with them to have a two-way QSO. He attended the ARRL convention in Chicago and met hundreds of American amateurs, and he bought some equipment to take home to Nice. But the notable thing he did was to consult with a fellow called John Reinhardt's 1XAM about changes to receiver design that could be made so that a receiver could be tuned to shorter wavelengths. And he brought that knowledge and the equipment back to France. And strangely, it was he that achieved the milestone of getting across the Atlantic with a two-way QSO. First with Fred Snell, the traffic manager, 1 MO on 100 metres, followed by this chap Reinhardt, who had been to visit. This time Deloy had beaten us to it, the first Europe to US QSO. But only weeks later, one of our guys, a chap called Jack Partridge, 2KF or G2KF, also had a QSO with 1 MO, this time with Kenneth Warner, the fellow with the hat, on the key at the other end. The first UK to US two-way QSO, only a matter of weeks later. Now, just quickly, this is actually the house that Jack Partridge lived in. It's in Collier's Wood in South London, very near where I used to live as a child, and near where one of my club members, G6QN, Reg, you might remember that call sign, used to live very nearby. And this was the house that Jack Partridge achieved all these things from. Very narrow, detached house, and with only quite a short garden. I think some of those trees probably are in the garden. But those of us who worry about not having enough space for HF aerials could perhaps look at this amazing chap who had this amazingly small property and yet managed to achieve so much. Okay, QST published the news of the two-way QSO and explained about the move to 100 metres that had made it possible. And here we have a lovely cartoon with a little car, a shortwave car, knocking the 200-metre chap off his feet. Send up an interpreter quick. I'm trying to work a French ham and I can't get his lingo. It was all very new stuff. Some great cartoons. I mean, do you remember your first QSO across the pond? I actually went back through my now electrified or computerized log and found I first worked this chap in September 76. That's quite a long time ago. I had a crap report from him, 439, but I did get across. I suppose I was nearly 17 at that point, so I can't be too distraught about that. This time, for the December 23 tests, the RSGB didn't use 5WS because, of course, 5WS was Wireless Society, and that was not the name anymore. So we used G6XX and G5AT. But the tests were somewhat eclipsed by Deloy and Partridge having their two-way QSOs. But interestingly, what happened with 6XX and 5AT and with most of the European amateurs, what do you think they all did? They all moved to 100 metres. And they all got across. So there was a vast number who made it from east to west by just moving to shorter wavelengths. Now, this is just a very brief copy of a huge list of American stations and the signals, the people they heard on our side of the pond. And it's just worth looking at a few call signs here. So 2KF was Jack Partridge. 2KW was Byrne. He was the fellow who heard the US stations before Godley did in 21. 2NM, anyone who know what 2NM was? Gerald Marcuse, yes, later RSGB president and worthy of UK amateur radio. 2SZ, anyone? Mill Hill School, where Goyder got to New Zealand. And 5AT was an RSGB station, as was 6XX. And of course, who was 8AB? Leon Deloy, bloody nemesis. The P and, sorry, I shouldn't swear, the P and M call signs were Dutch. So a lot of people were getting across. So things had really, really opened up by this point. And then just very quickly, before we talk about what we're doing in December, things really did move on in 24. The 16th of October 24, a chap called Ernest Simmons, 2 Oscar Delta, his signals were heard in New Zealand, and within 2 days, Cecil Goyder, operating the 2SZ station at Mill Hill, made a two-way QSO with Frank Bell in New Zealand and was able to be told that Ernest Simmons had been heard 2 days previously. And then within hours or minutes, Jack Partridge from his little house also got to New Zealand. So It's quite a lot of movement. Things were really progressing. Well, that brings us to the end of the history, and we've just got another 10 minutes or so just to talk about what we're going to be doing in December this year. And we're really celebrating the centenary of that success in the third Transatlantic Tests, which were the ones where we had our success. Okay, in 2021, I don't know, you might be aware that we had some celebrations with the ARRL, but these were very much specialist celebrations for high-power 160-metre stations, and many of us were able to work some of the Americans, and the call sign GB2ZE was activated from Scotland with the Kilmarnock and Loudon Amateur Radio Club and a team of GMDX guys sharing the operating. But this year, in 2022, we want the celebrations to be for all RSGB members. So our aim is to be very inclusive this year. As December 2022 is the centenary of the 5WS, the first to get across, we're going to be using the 5WS call sign, which we've managed to get relicensed for the RSGB for the entire month of December. With Ofcom, we've had some help getting these old call signs back. 5WS, G6XX you've probably come across already, which we've been using a lot for contesting. 5AT, which I only discovered very recently, was an RSGB club call sign, so pick that one up as well. 6ZZ was used in 1924 for RSGB experiments in conjunction with 6XX to transmit from a moving railway train. And then 3DR, well, it was GM 3DR, as Chris Tran will tell you. Repeatedly. And we're going to use the 5WS suffixes for the other 6 regions of the UK and Crown dependencies. Very abbreviated rules of this event in December. 11 call signs, which you've just listed. CW, phone and digital modes. QSOs will be valid for award on these 3 modes. When we say digital, that can be RTTY, PSK, FT8, FT4, or any other peculiar flavour of digital transmission. And this will apply on these 9 bands. Obviously 30 metres has only got 2 options. And the maximum number of QSOs with each call sign then is 26. 9 on CW, 9 digital and 8 on SSB. And then from that we end up with a series of awards. To work each of the 11 stations you can have a certificate, and then bronze for working 50-50 and silver 100 and etc. And the top scorers in the UK and internationally will end up with an award. Now I don't know if anyone's going to get to 200 QSOs. Be quite tricky, but we may get people getting to 150. What's his call sign? SP2EWQ, is it? He always crops up. He'll if anyone's going to do it, it'll be Alex who does it. So we have some support from Clublog very kindly. They've agreed to supply some support, rather like a DXpedition front end. People will be able to see the green blobs as they work the call signs on the different bands, and the figures will be summed for the 11 call signs, and there will be leaderboards for each country, just as we have for DXpeditions. So that should be good to motivate DX enthusiasts as they're familiar with that Clublog format. And this is a downloadable certificate, which will obviously have the appropriate words stuck on it when the QSOs have been made. Okay, so this is where you guys come in, and hopefully anyone who's watching at home as well. So you don't have to be a super station to take part in this. We want anybody who's got an HF radio who can log on a computer to take part. And if you're a foundation or intermediate licensee, we're hoping that someone else will be able to supervise you either at their station or at a club station to operate. And with a fairly recent dispensation from Ofcom, which probably comes from the GR2HQ station that we use every year, we can actually have the same call sign active on 26 slots at the same time. So there's really very little limit to how much we can use these call signs, which is why it would be great if, even if you can only have a couple of QSOs to do that, because you're not sort of holding anyone else up because there are 26 at any point in time. This schedule is available on a series of Google spreadsheets, accessible to anybody. How do you sign up? Well, very simply, there's a coordinator for each of the 11 call signs, and the email address is the same format for each one. So, for example, Bob here will be looking after G3DR and can be contacted on G3DR at rsgbcc.org. Very simple. Now, what we're recommending initially for England is that people in regions 5 and 11 would use G3DR. Now, that isn't mandatory, but we're just trying to share it out. The G5AT call sign, we're sort of saying to people, well, if you've done a bit with the regional call sign, then why not do a bit afterwards with G5AT? But ideally, we'll find some people who'll kick off G5AT at the beginning as well. So there are fewer call signs than we had for the cricket, but because we've got this ability to have 26 on at the same time, that seemed pretty appropriate. And also, we've got this bit of paper going round, which hopefully you've put your name on. You're not obliged to take part just because you've signed up, but we will contact you and nag you to take a slot at some point if your name's on the list. Of course, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. The RSGB website has a load of information. The history bit that I went through quite rapidly is spelt out in ridiculous detail, and that email address is one where you can contact the RSGB Contest Club at any point. So that's pretty much it. So I'm hoping you'll all be keen to take part, even if you can only do a little bit. I know December is a busy month, but it's also a month when we tend to be indoors and looking for things to occupy ourselves when we're not having festivities with our families. So let's hope you can do a bit of that.
Right, thank you, Nick. Have we got any questions? I have one. Oh, is the sheet still around? Do sign up.
We haven't got the components, I don't believe we've got the components to recreate the transmitter from 1922. And probably wouldn't get much thanks if we did. The Americans tried to recreate their 1BTG transmitter, but
yes,
I think
it failed.
I think Andy PIQ is the only person who heard it before it blew up.
I was also thinking that if you had to do the EMF calculation for it, might not work.
I don't know.
Are the French doing anything for this
I haven't heard any mention of the French, strangely. Yeah, they can celebrate next year, can't they?
So, I mean, this is a great opportunity, isn't it? I mean, we really, everyone who's come here ought to have a go, didn't they? Has everyone signed the sheet? Who hasn't signed the sheet? Let's do it in the negative. No. Yeah, I mean, there's so much opportunity for a few hours on all bands.
You might have the pile-ups of a Bouvet DXpedition from your own home. Well, that might put you off.
I think you're stretching it there.
You'll certainly get some decent pile-ups if you want them.
Yeah, question, hang on, I'll just bring you the mic.
Given the fact that we're celebrating the Transatlantic Tests,
yes,
I was slightly surprised when you suggested that any QSO anywhere counted.
Yep. Well, we did something very focused last year, which was talking to Americans and only on top band. So this year we've opened it up to talking to anybody on any band, because it's not just celebrating specific tests across the Atlantic. It's also celebrating the whole dawn of HF two-way communication, and that is a worldwide thing. Yeah. And there were other things, and while this was going on, there were other tests happening to do with Pacific communications and the like. But obviously, we're only thinking about what happened here. But anyway, we're hoping for a lot of interest from different countries. I've actually sent information to a lot of radio societies and had lots of responses that they'll publicise it. And so we're hoping there'll be lots of people at the other end wanting to talk to us. And it's the sort of event which will, if it gets going quickly, will gain its own momentum. I don't know if you remember the Spanish 70-year thing they had fairly recently. Had a fantastic take of over 1 million QSOs, and huge numbers of British stations had QSOs with them, the AME thing. And if they can do that, then we should better do something similar, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think the key to that Spanish one was there was always someone there, wasn't there?
Yeah,
Which
they
is
were
why
on a
we've
lot.
got to get the stations on the air.
Yeah.
Got to be there.
Sorry, Paul.
I know, Nick, you've had some thoughts about how we can encourage some of the Crown dependencies and perhaps the rarer UK entities to take part. You want to say anything about
Well,
that?
we have tried to find people who might be willing to travel to the Isle of Man or Jersey or Guernsey. The Guernsey people weren't very keen on having anyone travel there, but they think they can provide quite a lot of resources, and they're probably in quite a strong position. So if anyone would like to have a little de-expedition to Jersey or the Isle of Man in December, then I'm sure you'll have every encouragement. Maybe not financially, but by whatever other means. Maybe like those QRM babes tied up at the North Pole will stick a spike into you and encourage you to set off, or like the Godley on the Aquitania will stand and wave you off as you go across to the Isle of Man.
Free RSGB hats.
Possibly. Could be possible. Okay, well, thanks a lot, everyone. And let's hope we have some fun. I mean, the whole point is to provide entertainment. I mean, I'm used to running contests. I just see this as another form of entertainment. We've got our licenses. What can we do with them to be entertaining? And this is a form of entertainment which is pretty good.